Today is September 30th, 2021, and today was the first ever National Day of Truth and Reconciliation within Canada. It's a new holiday, though using the word holiday to describe it feels a bit wrong given the circumstances. What it really is a day to remember and reflect upon perhaps the darkest period in Canadian history, which is the residential school system, which mistreated and abused and in some cases murdered indigenous Canadians for, I believe it was about 100 years. And it continued, believe it or not, all the way until 1998 is when the last residential school was closed. As a person who is not indigenous to Canada in any way, I had to think for a while if I should make a video about this. It's definitely a place where, it's more important to listen than to speak. There's other people out there you should pay more attention to than me today. Now, with that being said, I'm obviously making this video, and the reason for that is I'm in the privileged position of having a channel that a lot of new arrivals to Canada find because I've made a lot of Canadian videos. So, there could be people who have heard of this day, they don't really have the full context. There could be people from other countries who have no idea what I'm talking about and have clicked on this video just to get a bit of Canadian education. So even though I'm not the best person to be speaking right now, I'm going to share a bit in hopes of sharing some truth. The residential school system was a system that was taking people from their local communities, their families, their way of life, and erasing the cultures of the indigenous people of our country. Stealing the children, essentially, and putting them in residential schools for education. And some of this education involved cutting off people's hair. Some of this education involved not permitting children to speak their own languages. Some of this education involved, in a thousand different ways, just telling people that your way of life is wrong, this is the new way to behave. The language of the time was basically to, who was it who used the phrase kill the Indian in them? Yeah, I think that was one of the architects of the residential school who used the phrase, and I apologize for saying these words, but to kill the Indian, which was, they weren't hiding it. They were trying to erase the culture and turn it into something else. And today, this day is commemorated by many by wearing an orange shirt. And that is because of one woman who was a survivor of the residential school system. And she told the story of when she was 6 years old, her first day in the schools, how her grandmother had given her an orange shirt to wear. And as soon as she got to the school, it was stolen from her and she was given something else, and she never got that shirt back. So it's a simple image, a simple metaphor perhaps for the theft of the identity that happened to hundreds of thousands of Canadians, just based on who they were, where they were from, just based on who they were. The other important thing to say here is that let's not pretend like this is all in the history books and it's like, oh wow, can't believe it lasted until 1998 and then 1999 rolled around and everything was perfect. No. I grew up in Winnipeg, which is a city with a very high concentration of Indigenous Canadians. I think per capita we have the most Indigenous Canadians of any major city in Canada. And racism is still a huge issue. There are a lot of people who are in pain, and there's a lot of people whose pain is transmitted through drugs and alcohol, and there's a lot of people who have been failed by this country, and this isn't a comfortable story to share for me. It's not my proudest moment, but when I was in high school in Winnipeg, I had he's still my friend. I'm not going to say the guy's name, but I have a friend who is an indigenous Canadian, and yeah, he was my buddy in high school and hardworking dude. Like I would say the first out of our friend group to get a job, and he always wanted to save money, and he wanted to buy a car, and he did. So he bought a 1985 Cadillac DeVille. If you guys know cars, like this thing is like, it looks like an old boat, like a 1985 Cadillac DeVille, beautiful car. But for whatever reason, it was a total cop magnet. I think the fact that it's a Cadillac, and more importantly, the fact that my friend was indigenous. He would tell me, I get stopped by cops all the time. He's like, anywhere I go, anytime I see a cop, they're going to pull me over and ask to see my license and registration because they just assumed it was stolen. They saw a young guy who looks visibly indigenous, and they saw this kind of Cadillac car, and they just assumed it was stolen. And I'm embarrassed to say, I thought he was exaggerating. Like when he said, like, anytime he sees a cop, they pull him over. I didn't actually believe it. I thought, like, okay, you know, come on, maybe it happened once or twice, but then one day we're driving together and a cop pulls up. Cop's driving right behind him. And my buddy just goes, damn it. Watch, they're gonna pull me over. And I'm like almost smirking. I'm like, what are you talking about? We're not doing anything wrong. Like typical like privileged Canadian dude. Like what do you mean they're gonna pull you over? Like we're just doing the speed limit. And then the sirens go on. The cop pulls us over. License and registration. And I'm just sitting there like, whoa. That what you said happened, just happened. He told me, I just wasn't listening. And I try to remember that sometimes when Indigenous Canadians speak about situations that I have no reference point to, it doesn't have to make sense to me, right? If you're hearing someone talk about a trauma, you don't need to, like, it's not your story, it's someone else's story. But when they tell you their story, you need to be able to listen. And frankly, a lot of Canadians who are not Indigenous, especially people who, like, maybe you know, there's a lot of immigrants in Canada. Maybe someone's family moved here 10 years ago and they're like, hey, we weren't here for the residential school system. Not my problem. But the problem with that way of thinking is you're still living within a system which was formed by the reality that we live in. Like you're still living in a system where this group of people had their identities stolen and tried to have their way of life erased. And if you are not aware of that fact, you're part of the problem. You're part of the reason why justice is not happening. Remember, it's not about you, and remember to listen and to really listen, not just to say, like, to see the headline and be like, hundreds of dead children, and just shake your head and be like, terrible. How could the Catholic Church do it? Or how could that prime minister back then have allowed this to happen? It's like, nah, man, like, don't. Well, yes, like you should hold those people accountable, but like you need to feel it as well, because if we're gonna build a country together, we all need to be in this together, right? Yeah, if there are ads on this video, if you get ads at the beginning, any money earned from this video is going to be donated to a place I found today called the Native Friendship Center of Montreal. Yeah, their mission is to promote, develop, and enhance the quality of life in Montreal's urban Indigenous community. So I would say this is a very relevant charity for a day like this. So I'll put a link to that in the description as well if anyone is inspired to make a donation of their own. Thanks for listening.